make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Child tax credits, child allowances, all of that stuff. Most of the countries that have spent a ton of money, they haven't seen a real improvement either in child well-being or in the birth rate. But just sort of what we're doing now, I think is probably about right. You give parents a $2,000 tax credit for each kid. It should grow with inflation. I would, in a couple other ways, expand it a little bit just to provide sort of equality for families vis-a-vis other people. But just throwing a ton of money at it often doesn't help if you're not changing the culture actively.
Hello, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us via YouTube, it's great to be back for another episode of Faithful Politics with you. I'm Josh Burtram, your faithful host, and I'm joined by our political host, Will. It's good to see you, Will. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing great. Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely. So today we're excited. We get to interview on our show Timothy Carney. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on civil society, family, localism, religion in America, economic competition, and electoral politics. He's concurrently a senior columnist at the Washington Examiner, and Mr. Carney's forthcoming book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. And we're going to be talking to him about that and anywhere else that the conversation leads us. So thank you so much for being on the show today, Tim. Can I call you Tim?
Yes, Tim. Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely, man. It's such a pleasure to have you. So if you could just, I gave a short little snippet there, but kind of help our listeners understand who is Tim Carney and why did you become interested in writing about families and how our culture is unfriendly to them?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we have 6 children. So this is a topic where I
will be praying for you.
Thank you. And praying for my wife as I'm on
Yes,
tour.
Definitely.
So it's something I know a little bit about. I'm also a political journalist. You mentioned AEI, where I'm a scholar, a fellow here. So I do lots of research, and a couple things have really emerged and become clear in the last few years. One, there's an epidemic of childhood anxiety. You guys have probably seen about this, and it's so much that the pediatrician organizations, the Biden White House declared this epidemic. It's definitely much higher than it ever was before. Parents are stressed. Also, you've probably noticed the birth rate is falling and it's low. Americans still say they want 2.7 kids or so, and they're getting
How do you have 0.7 kids? Can you answer that one for me, Tim?
Well, sometimes when it comes time to chores, I feel like some of my kids are about 0.25.
Yes.
But our birth rate's way down to 1.7. And so all of this, some people say, oh, well, the young people are selfish, or it's just about economics. I don't like either of those explanations, and I don't think the data and my reporting would say that those explanations are adequate. And so I realized it had to be something with our culture. That is to say, every kid needs 2 parents to raise them, ideally, but that's not enough. Families need to be supported by culture. In all sorts of ways, though, our culture is family unfriendly, whether it's, local sports like a rec league where the coaches are volunteers being replaced by a expensive and intensive travel team where you end up in a tournament in Delaware every weekend, or whether it's dating and mating culture where the kids, the 20-somethings aren't getting married. The apps are breaking their brains, and our culture just isn't into the sacrifice and commitment that's marriage. And finally, our values, which is that the idea of commitment, of laying down your life for somebody else, that those are out the door, and we're hyper-individualistic, we're transactional rather than relational. So all of these aspects of our culture, I think, are causing the parental stress, the childhood anxiety, and the aversion to starting a family.
That's awesome. I want to ask you a question about something that was on the inside cover of your book, because I learned a word, and it said Tim Carney, the father of a passel of kids himself. And I've never heard of the word passel.
I noticed that one too, Will.
A unit of measurement. Like, what is a passel?
Well, you know how like there's a murder of crows, there's a passel of carnies. I think they were just trying to find the marketing folks thought that like a horde of kids or a mob would be too scary. And sometimes when we show up, people are kind of intimidated. Is this some sort of Irish gang that is arriving at our place?
That's amazing.
But no, actually, one of the arguments I make in the book is that in a lot of places, in a lot of situations in my life, just showing up with my kids makes other people happy. And so you throw, and not because my kids are awesome, and we're not the Von Trapp family. They don't show up and start singing in some harmony or whatever. They just show up and they're kids. But like
mine do, Tim. Mine do.
Well, maybe I need to try
they do
harder.
Not.
Show up at a Friday fish fry. We're Catholic. Show up at a Friday fish fry at the parish, and suddenly people are like, yes, we have a quorum. You eight people walk in, and
yes.
And one of the stories I tell in the last chapter is of this teacher in preschool who taught 5 of my kids. And then she sends out an email being like, oh, I won't be here for the last day of school, so tomorrow's my last day. So we couldn't get her a gift. There was no way. My wife and I are not super planner ahead people. And so we don't have time to go get her a gift. And so Katie's like, what are we going to do? So when the teacher opens the door, expecting it just to be my littlest one at 7:30, it's all 5 of them that she taught, including, the boys who are now towering over her. And she starts crying, and my kids, and it's a big hug. And I realized the gift I brought her was my kids. So people make fun of parents, and they're like, you think your kids are God's gift to the world? And I was saying, I do think children are a gift. They're a gift to us. So this is my long way of saying a passel was a vaguely positive way of saying an unruly mob of kids.
That's great. I got to say, when I was reading through your book, that I felt 2 things at one time. One thing, I felt just this tension of like, yeah, the things you're saying make sense. And just thinking about the amount of people I know that fit into these categories of overworked, stressed, trying to figure out how to get their kids on, into the rat race. My kid's got to be number 1. They're going to fail college because they got a C in 3rd grade math. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This kind of things, like just this stress and this overwork. And then at the same time, just this longing to like, man, it would be nice to have a simpler life. And, one of the points that you make is talking about the amount of stress that's on parents, which I'd love for you to go into. But I wanted to ask you, so my wife sent me an article last night. She'll be like, say, hey, you should have this person on the podcast. She was very interested in your book when we received it. She's like, hey, did you see the article about the parents that got convicted for the first time for manslaughter about their children's actions? The parents got convicted. And of course, I'm not trying to oversimplify this, right? Because, giving your kid a gun and whatever, I don't know all the ins and outs of the case, and I don't want to speak out of turn. But this idea that now parents are like, oh, wait, now I got to worry that I'm going to get convicted if my kid does something really terrible.
Yep.
What? And that kind of just adds.
The logic
Talk to us
of that.
about what's the stress? What's happening in our society with this?
So there's this quote that I use about twice in the book from this woman, Stephanie Murray, who says, once having children became this deliberate choice that you personally chose, you signed up for this responsibility. You, mom and dad, signed up for this responsibility. Instead of it's not anymore the kind of, well, that's sort of what most adults do. You get married, you have kids. You can opt out of that course, but that's the normal, natural course of doing it. Now it's, intentional. We talk about intentional living, but suddenly this is one thing you specifically decided to do, like buying a boat. Well, then you're responsible for it. Totally responsible. Obviously, parents have the primary responsibility for their children. There's no doubt about it. Obviously, the nuclear family is the most important institution in society, I think. But that idea that you control your kid's outcome, that's part of the logic there, which just isn't true. And that's part of what I try to tell parents to relax is The good news is you don't have to worry that much. The bad news is because you can't actually control how your child turns out. So that can be a little bit relieving. But that idea that we need to apologize for bringing our children on an airplane, you've seen those videos, somebody gets a little goodie bag to pass everyone around them with like a drink ticket and earplugs. And you get it, they're trying to be nice. But no, children are not something we should need to apologize. And then if our kid does mess up, whether it's mess up in that he gets kicked out of school for, some violation, he brought in pot, he doesn't do his homework, he talks back to the teacher, or something as dramatic as what you're talking about. That idea that, well, we have failed if our kid messes up, that, first of all, I mean, I'm a Christian. I think that's a deeply unchristian idea. I think your children are made in the image of God and they have infinite value no matter what they do. And there are better and worse ways to raise kids, but the pressure that comes, okay, the kid should be listening to Mozart in the womb. You need to make sure that
Yes.
they reach these certain milestones by this age. You should be getting them a tutor. You should be putting them on a travel team instead of just letting them languish in some little league where they're being coached by some volunteer dad. All these things that are supposedly bad. It's the cause of that childhood anxiety. There's no doubt in my mind that childhood anxiety is caused by a lack of kids just like riding their bike until the streetlight turns on. There's all sorts of reasons why that's disappeared, but one of the reasons is this parental pressure that every minute the kid needs to be getting enriched to build up for some measurable success as an adult, rather than being a kid, having an expansive childhood.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that you're a Catholic, you're a Christian. I'd love maybe for you to kind of unpack like how sort of your own faith belief and maybe just the broader sort of just, community of believers, like how their faith really kind of ties into like raising a child. And before you answer, I know for me, so we live in Virginia. My wife's family lives in Indiana, northern Indiana. My family lives in California. So in Virginia, like it's just the four of us. Like I've just me, my wife, and my two young boys. And our church family is basically like our family. I mean, like when my oldest was going through a lot of like medical issues, he had a brain tumor.
Oh wow.
And, it was the church family that really helped support us. Like, and I'd say church, like Josh's church, because I go to Josh's church.
Will.
Yeah. And I'd imagine that's probably pretty similar across the country. So like, maybe you can kind of elaborate about like the role of community and faith with raising kids.
Yes. So we mentioned the birth rate a little bit earlier. The birth rate for people who go to church, synagogue, mosque, whatever, at least weekly, is well above 2. It's about in the middle for people who have a religious connection but aren't going every week. And then it's lowest for people who don't belong. And that's not necessarily atheists. That's people who are not attending. And I know there are some pastors out there that probably think that it's their eloquent homilies on be fruitful and multiply that are making the difference. But what you're calling the church community is really that's the big question, the big issue here. So we could abstract it a little bit and say, families need communities. They need support. They need mentors. They need, older couples. They need a place to meet somebody like-minded. They need to have babysitters. Our old parish in Maryland, before we moved across the river to Northern Virginia, our old parish there was a list of babysitters that it was like the college age or recent graduate kids or older high school kids of other parishioners, and you would call on them. And then, so all of those things get tied together. But to be more specific about religion, some of the studies I looked at said exactly how does religion cause people to have more kids? And it's just values. If there are parents who say, well, our kids are the most important thing and we want them, I mean, not our kids, I shouldn't say that, because kid-centric can be a problem. Our family is the most important thing, and we want our children to have their own families. Well, they will make sacrifices to do that. So if grandma helps watch a firstborn, she's much more likely to get a second grandchild. Statistically, there are studies about that. Israel is the center chapter in my book. religion is obviously very important there, but the secular Israelis have a higher birth rate than all of Europe. And guess what? In Israel, 70% of mothers get help from their own mother in raising their kids. It's half that rate in Europe and probably in the United States as well. That's all tied up with religion. It's not necessarily the heart of religion, but it's tied up, and religious communities do that much better than secular communities do. And so, not to say that a great neighborhood or a great public school won't, those do release some of the stress on parents. They do probably result in more babies being born. But notably, you can't find, I combed through the data, what is a measurable, identifiable community that has more than 2 babies? Every one that I found was a religious community.
Wow. That's amazing. So I grew up in a Pentecostal tradition, and my wife and I were both ordained in the Assemblies of God. She's still ordained. I actually let my credentials lapse, but that's not what the show is about. But what we did notice that when we would go to like conferences or something, when we would go there, people were so like, they loved seeing our kids. Mm-hmm. They wanted to hold the baby. They were just so sweet to our children. And we felt, oh, wow. And we had it was noticeable, the difference between like, hey, you're coming into this community that values kids.
Oh, yeah.
Versus most of the rest of our experience, like taking into a restaurant, people give you like looks when your kid's loud, they're upset about it, and I get it. When I go out on a date, the last thing I want to do is hear a kid screaming, because that's what I had to deal with at home. But kind of like the sense I get from reading your book is that this has been a shift in American culture. Kind of go into some of these. What are some of these major shifts? You had alluded to them before, but maybe even, and you can pick out 1 or 2 that you want to go into more detail on. What are the big shifts that have happened that have made it so that kids, like our culture is more unfriendly to families as a whole and to having children? What are some of these shifts, and what do they look like for us to be able to recognize them?
So some of it is just us being more workist. I use the word workism. That was a sort of almost, there's this writer, Derek Thompson at The Atlantic, and he said, as our society is more secular, we get all these new atheisms. Atheism is like, a godless religion, and that workism is one of those. And, America, we've always had a work ethic. And I believe it's true that doing good work is fulfilling our purpose on this earth. But that work can include raising kids, Absolutely. By the way. But trying to find meaning in our careers is, it's hard for me to talk about this because I'm so lucky. This is my job. My job and my family, they really overlap. But ultimately, I've had bosses who have always said, your career is never going to bring you as much value, as much reward as your family. But that's not an idea that's widely held. And so I looked at the countries that try to sort of stimulate their birth rate by spending a lot of money. A lot of them do it by subsidizing childcare and subsidizing parental leave. And these are great things for families, especially needy families. But they don't end up being pro-family as much as they end up being pro-work. They end up subsidizing work. So that's one thing. And then as the number of children get smaller in a society, I think that makes people, you'll see 2 different effects. One, people who visit like the sort of nominally Catholic countries along the Mediterranean, they find all these would-be grandmas coming up and just wanting to hold every little baby. But on the other hand, you go into a cafe that nobody brings kids into, and you're the first person to bring a kid in there in a month, suddenly everybody's scowling at you. And there have been multiple stories recently about South Korea, how unwelcome children are in most public places because they have so few. So that's why it's a little spiral down. That's why I think we should worry about a birth rate at 1.6, 1.7, because then more people are going through their days not seeing kids. So I live in Washington, D.C. If you are to the degree Congress still does anything, a lot of it is done by congressional staffers. These are, 20 somethings, early 30 somethings. Vast majority of them have no children. Not only that, a vast majority of them, if they, live in DC, ride the metro, walk, Uber, take a scooter, they will go Monday through Friday without seeing a kid. Now, maybe if they go to catch, a movie that also appeals to kids, they'll see kids, or they'll see the kids going into the movie next door but it's very easy to go 7 days a week if you're in some of these people's lives without seeing children. They're the ones who are making the policy. They're the one, and if children aren't on their mind. So a big part of it is just this spiral of less kids makes people think about kids less. And guess what? We need to accommodate children. You need to build playgrounds. You need to build sidewalks. So one of the chapter 3, it has the word fecundity in the title, which I realize not everybody knows that, but it's
what a great word, though. What a great word.
And I said, if you want fecundity in the sheets, you need walkability in the streets. You need to let your kids run. That's what parents need more of. And so as we accommodate families less, it adds to the stress.
That's pretty much. I'm gonna put that on a T-shirt, I think. Because
why is everybody asking me questions about my fecundity T-shirt?
well, because then they'll ask me about it. I'll point them to your book.
There we go.
It's a win-win. But you said something that I thought was actually pretty profound, and I hadn't really ever thought about it. About these subsidies tend to be pro-work, not necessarily like pro-family, which I've never really quite considered, because I remember when, I don't know if it was a couple years ago, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like our favorite liberal, like on my side anyways, put out something about her staffers can bring their kids to work, and like she wants to really sort of support the sort of like family thing. And at the time I thought, hey, that's pretty awesome. Bring your kid, whatever. But to your point, it's like they're still at work. Like how much quality time can you spend with your kid like at work? So I'm interested in what are some things the government can do to actually encourage families to just spend more time together?
Well, I'll answer twofold because you talked about employers. So one thing is just the word accommodation I use, that has to get used more, and partly because it's at odds with one idea of treating everybody absolutely equal. Because if you accommodate somebody, you're not treating them equal. If, there's somebody who needs help getting upstairs, or you open an elevator for somebody that normally wouldn't be open to the public, that's an accommodation. It's in line with the way AOC uses the word equity, right? Try to get and so families need accommodation would be part of it. So one is the number one thing that parents want is flexibility. If every working mother got to snap her fingers, most of them would actually keep their job, but they would be home at 3:00 when the school bus drops off, or they would be there in line to pick up their kids at 3 p.m. That's what most American mothers who currently work would want. And so that sort of accommodation, as much as possible, is going to be the thing. A couple other things I talk about is helping parents of newborns. And so obviously they're not going to have sleep. So that's where maternity leave is really important. Paternity leave is great, but not for everybody. So for me, I took off 2 weeks, and then my wife wanted me out of the house. So I thought, man, if I could have used my paternity leave when my daughter was like 14 and we could go on a canoeing trip for a week. So that's sort of having that parental leave. You can use it at any time. It's also a way to build loyalty with your employees. As far as what government can do, I mentioned sidewalks and playgrounds. There's an infrastructure of family that needs to be built. We had a debate when I lived in Maryland, in my home county, about putting more sidewalks in certain neighborhoods. And people said there'd be some trees, even some cherry blossom trees, that would be killed if we put in sidewalks. And somebody said, but my kids have to literally walk in the road to get to school. And one of the homeowners said, well, your kids shouldn't be walking to school alone anyway. And it's just like, the infrastructure, the norms all have to be put in place to accommodate. And daycare subsidies, unfortunately, again, they provide a big benefit for a lot of families, especially needy ones, but they more drive people into work, as I said. And then there's questions that we can talk about money, child tax credits, child allowances, all of that stuff. Most of the countries that have spent a ton of money, they haven't seen a real improvement either in child well-being or in the birth rate. But just sort of what we're doing now, I think is probably about right. You give parents a $2,000 tax credit for each kid. It should grow with inflation. I would, in a couple other ways, expand it a little bit just to provide sort of equality for families vis-a-vis other people. But just throwing a ton of money at it often doesn't help if you're not changing the culture actively.
Yeah, that idea of how do you actually change the culture is such a big issue. Like, I've heard things about China and its one-child policy, and then trying to change it and shift it, and how difficult it is when you've had a generation or more, right? Several generations that are like, having more than one child is bad, and then trying to shift that, how difficult that is. I'm thinking about the economics of all of this. Like, one of the points that you made was that it's expensive, right? To, like, the economics aren't the whole story, but it's expensive to raise children. And part of the expense is this pressure.
Yep.
Like certain pressures that you have for your children to succeed. Can you kind of describe that and help us understand what that means? Like the economic pressure, like how does it contribute? And then how is it not the whole story?
That's a great question. So first of all, if you think of, I was thinking this one tweet by a journalist friend of mine when right before they had their first baby, there's this common sort of genre form on Twitter where it's like a two-step process. And so step one is researches the cost of a night nurse. So somebody to come and you put your kid back to sleep so you can actually sleep when you have a newborn. Researches the cost of a night nurse. Step two, researches how to have a socialist revolution. In other words, this writer could only imagine help coming from the market or the state. And so if you then expand that of, okay, well, I want my kid to be able to play baseball, but you don't think of sort of the community thing where you volunteer and you coach first base and, it's pretty low cost and you man the snack shack and it's fun, but not amazing. And instead you're thinking, well, baseball is supposed to be about really learning to hit and throw. And I'm going to look into the cost of travel ball. It's like $800 if I have two kids and like two sports. Suddenly this becomes insane. Similarly, if you think you need to get your kid a tutor, we got our kid a tutor for sort of remedial math. And I realized everybody else there was not remedial. It was let's get ahead of our classmates. If you think you need to, get them the absolute best of everything, which a lot of people do. We ran a focus group and there were men who said, the reason I'm not ready is because if I got married now and started a family, I'd be able to give them the bare minimum, but I don't want to give my kids the bare minimum. I want to give them the best. Now, if what you mean by that is sort of love and advice and a great safe environment, great. But they mean family vacations that are super memorable and the Eiffel Tower and yada, yada. And so those pressures really add to the cost of raising children. Now, how much does economics explain either the anxiety of children or the low birth rates? The anxiety, a lot of the data shows that the wealthier families, their kids end up with more anxiety precisely because they're more pressure. These sort of high achieving public schools that, everybody pays $1.4 million to live in that school district. And so many of the kids will go on to Ivies. Those have more childhood anxiety than working class and poor high schools. That was a study that, of all the things I saw, that was the most surprising thing. More abuse of drugs, not because kids can afford it more, but again, because of that anxiety. Then the other thing is wealthier families don't really have more children in America. Wealthier countries certainly don't have more children worldwide. Millennials aren't really poorer than Gen X or than the boomers. If you look at their wealth adjusted for inflation at a given age, it's about the same. You can't say raising kids has become more unaffordable and therefore that's why people aren't having kids. That's why they're more stressed, because the data just don't point to that. With one big exception. In the last 3 years, the price of housing has gone way up. That statistically does deter people from getting married and starting family. But the baby bust started back in 2008. We've had fewer babies every year for 15 years. So it definitely predates this housing inflation we've had in the last 3 years.
That's really interesting. I'm curious if you've done any studies, because I know that you also do electoral politics as well. Like, is there any sort of noticeable trends between like whether Democrat or Republican are in office?
Is in office. No, I was going to say, though, as far as more liberal parents are more stressed out and more liberal parents do have fewer kids. I think, though, so Will, you might be the test case of this. I think if you control for religiosity, that would go away. I think it's that more religious parents are just, for reasons we discussed at the beginning, are more likely to have kids and less likely to sign up to this achievement obsession that causes the anxiety.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Because, I was wondering, I mean, maybe we are sort of a bit of the exception. I mean, my wife and I are both, token liberals. We knew we wanted to have kids when we first got married, and we got married in 2008. But we were kind of like part of that demographic where we're like, I don't know. We weren't making a whole lot of money, and we're just like, it was just her and I, and we wanted to wait a couple years just to kind of enjoy married life. And then when we finally committed ourselves to having kids, it wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be. And that there was like this whole, like, I don't know, like the situation that was brewing. Like we had a foster child because we used to be youth pastors and we wanted to find more, a job that paid more. So then finally, like on one day, it's like our foster child got placed. So then we wouldn't have that responsibility. We got a job offer. We were living in Washington State at the time. We got a job offer to move to Virginia that paid more money. And my wife took a pregnancy test and she was pregnant.
Wow.
Like all in one day. And we're just like, all right, God, like that. If that's a sign,
that's a big day.
Wow. Do you know the date? You gotta nail that down. That's a great day.
I can find it because I remember that like I posted a picture of like the pregnancy test on social media, and it just kind of went crazy. All the grandparents, like they all freaked out. But like, that's our story. But I also know other people that are like, I don't want to have kids because of, like fill in the blank reason, like the environment, the money, the blah, 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 blah. So like, what's your best argument for why Americans should have kids?
So, first of all, that kids are good. As I was saying earlier, they make people happy. And it's funny, in sort of think tank world, you're always looking for social science data. And I was reading this study, and it was showing how, people are more likely to contribute to charity, like throwing money in a basket if there are kids that they can see. And so not counting parents, other people, and a charity that has nothing to do with kids. And then there were other studies about sort of the happiness of societies and correlating with their birth rate. And then suddenly I realized, wait, I'm trying to prove that like babies make people happy. Shouldn't that be evident? Especially the non-parents, the people who aren't waking up in the middle of the night, they're made happy by it. But so that's one. Number two is, well, I'll just skip to the end because you guys, I think, will get this. When I'm arguing for sidewalks and communities and Little League instead of travel sports, I'm saying these are ways to make parenting easier. But if you've done it, you know that raising children will be the hardest thing you'll ever do. But if you have goals for yourself that are high enough, like being a man or a woman of virtue, as I would put it, becoming a saint, then parenting is actually the easiest road. In the book, I call it a cheat code for virtue. doesn't guarantee you're going to be virtuous, but it makes it easier. There are other ways to be a good man or a good woman, but they're all harder. The Bible says we're supposed to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. I wake up in the morning and there are hungry, naked people in my house. They're right there waiting for me. It's just easier to be selfless when you have kids that you're responsible for. So that's sort of my ultimate line, because I speak on this to law students and college kids who I know will be career oriented. And that's the argument I make. That final one is the main argument I make to steer them towards parenthood. You should want to be something big, better than, wealthy and successful. You should want to be virtuous. And this is actually going to be the easiest path to that.
Yeah. And I'm curious, like, what does the data say about, childless adults, in their sort of, retirement age type thing? Because I often think my mom, she's like this little old 70s Asian lady that's like still super active. She's on a bowling team and all kinds of other stuff. But like at one point in time, she's going to become too old to bowl. And like, I feel a certain level of responsibility and obligation to like take care of my mom, because like she raised me, and I couldn't imagine sort of being like, 70, 80, 90, whatever, and not having kids to just be with me in my convalescent home, or when I'm on my deathbed. So like, is there any data that shows sort of the well-being of adults that don't have kids?
More than data, there's just stories out of Japan, basically, this society where the birth rate has been super low, where workism became something of a religion. And there's just stories of the sadness of the elderly, of people dying and not being discovered for weeks. I try not to, in Family Unfriendly, I don't want to lean on that. I think it was a little too dark to really say this is a reason to have kids, is to avoid this fate. But certainly the fact that there are countries that are a generation like Japan and South Korea ahead of us in this decline, or Europe that's half a generation ahead of us, those show us kind of what the future is. And that's one of the ways in which it's more sad. And so that idea that, again, children liven up and happy up the world, that I try to make it on the social level, but you're making the point, Will, that it definitely happens on the individual level. But I did talk to this woman. I was interviewing, I ended up on a trivia team full of strangers at a bar. I was working on the book and I took a break. I go out to the bar, I go on trivia, and this one woman, I tell her I have 6 kids, and she says, "Oh, that sounds awful." And then she's married. She has a good job. She says she doesn't want kids. And out of nowhere, without anybody else saying this, she says, "I hate the argument that you need kids to have someone to take care of you when you're older. With all the money I save from not having kids, I'll be able to afford a nice, clean retirement home." And she was always obsessed with that, the cleanliness, the filth of kids, the diapers. She kept using the word litter. And so that's a mindset that actually would sort of prefer the less human, prefer somebody who you're paying to take care of you, instead of the thought of, nobody wants to think of their kids changing their adult diapers when they're 85. But on another level, that's the natural way. And so I actually think that there is a mindset in America that's more transactional, that's more individualistic, that would rather have everything be a transaction and arm's length, rather than I changed your diaper 60 years ago, now you change mine.
Yeah. It's interesting. What do you think that how does technology play a role in all of this? Like, what role does even the sense of, one of the things you talk about is the sense of dread that people have, that bringing their kids into this world that is so difficult or is heading towards disaster or whatever it is, just pick your apocalyptic.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter which side you are. Everyone has an apocalyptic scenario that they're thinking about and worried about. What what role does like technology and this idea of how we're advancing and that might even be dystopian, what role does that play? And what are kind of some ways to think about that in a healthier way?
So at the start of the book, I talk about the fear that there's the belief that there's a skilled kidnapper around every corner. This one guy tells a story of getting up. He takes his kid to Costco. And if you've ever gone to Costco, there's like pizza that's really affordable right outside.
Yes.
So they get the pizza, they sit down, and then he's like, oh, I forgot the napkins. He walks 20 feet over, gets the napkins, comes back. Oh, I forgot the straws. Walks 20 feet over, gets the straws, come back. Gets a tap on the shoulder. That's a no-no. I work for Child Protective Services. You shouldn't leave your child like that. Think about that. It would, if there was somebody like in a Liam Neeson movie who's wanted to kidnap your child and had a waiting getaway car and they were skilled and armed, yes, that would be a dangerous situation. So that is the mindset of somebody who is constantly terrified. And you see this a lot with the constant worries about like, oh, your child is going to get sex trafficked. And they think that these are girls who are like grabbed from a shopping cart in a mall, which is not the way things happen. These stranger abductions happen. There's 100 of them a year, which is absolutely horrible. But that means your child, over the course of their childhood, has less than a 1 in 1 million chance of something like that happening to them. But because if 100 of them in the US happen a year and you follow the news constantly, in your mind, like some people use an evolutionary psychology explanation, we don't think that we can think of 330 million people as being us. But then when we're taking in the social media, we're not just watching the local news anymore. We're not just talking to the neighbors. We're taking the social media. So all these horrible things happen. And we think that they're going to happen to us. And then towards the end of the book, I get into climate change. And I quote Miley Cyrus saying, there's not going to be fish in the water, so why would I want to bring kids into this planet? And so these ideas, but then I quote Ezra Klein, a liberal New York Times writer who's very worried about what we're doing to the climate, saying, every climate scientist I know has kids. And in fact, if you've noticed, there's been this switch where a lot of the people who write about climate change, they've gone from constantly telling dark stories to trying to tell more hopeful stories because they realize all they were doing was depressing people and making them despair. And that wasn't the way to get the change they want. So I think, I guess this isn't so much about social media, but just the modern media and the ability to get news from all over the country, all over the world constantly. And then I work as a journalist, and I know that sort of negative and scaring people is easier to get clicks than telling an even-handed story. So I really think that negative worldview is at the heart of it. So that's why the last chapter, I used the phrase civilizational sadness, a belief that we just aren't good. We being humans, we being Americans, and that sort of thing. So actually, I want to ask you a question. Do you worry about sort of either you and your children causing climate change or about the world in the future? Do you worry about, the U.S. and our history of systemic racism, all of these things? How do they make you more dour? Do you see other people with your politics being more dour?
Yeah, what's interesting, and I'm actually glad you asked that question because like our family dynamic is very interesting. So my wife is white, and our kids don't really look anything like me. So like I don't really worry too much about my kids ever being called the N-word in school, or whatever. So like from a racism standpoint, that's not necessarily a big fear I have for my kids. They look pretty white. And from an environmental standpoint, I do worry about climate change but it's not a deterrent because like I feel that I'm going to raise my kids in a way that should, my anxiety about climate change like increases, that my kids will be the ones that'll figure it out. Like my oldest, I mentioned earlier, who had a brain tumor. I don't know how many times I've sat next to him, like in a hospital bed, just talked to him about, hey, what do you want to do? Trying to get him to be thinking about the future. and and he's got a heart for like medical stuff, and he's like, yeah, maybe I'll be a doctor and I can help other kids. And I'm like, perfect.
Wow.
like that's the hope I have for having children. I'm not necessarily all that doom and gloom, because my kids do bring me joy, and I think that they will bring joy to the world, and it just gives me a lot of hope for the future. So yeah, appreciate that. But now I want to ask you a question just about the Dobbs decision. So with the overturning of Roe, one would imagine that there would be more kids being brought into the world, rightly or wrongly. And I say that sort of somewhat with a grain of salt, because I know that the overturning of Roe was a pretty big deal, especially for folks kind of on the left side of the political spectrum. And this kind of ties into the earlier point we were making about subsidies from the government. Like in 20 years, these kids that are being born, are going to be sort of in sort of our society. And I really would love to kind of get your sort of thoughts, predictions about like what impact you think that may have sort of on America as a whole. Because I don't think that our economy, our system is necessarily set up to raise these kids. And there are organizations out there like we spoke with Abby Johnson, who big anti-abortion activist. And when we talked to her, she talked about some things her organization was doing, like, helping moms to buy them cars, set them up with jobs, she just had a lot of sort of like infrastructure to help moms that were sort of debating whether or not to have an abortion. But I'd love to kind of get your take on what effect do you think the Dobbs decision might have on sort of the family unit?
I mean, that's a big question and a tough one. So I'll just sort of say my first thoughts and reactions. Well, so there is definitely data that, as I would put it, that the Dobbs decision saved lives, that in places like Texas, a lot of babies were born who would have been aborted otherwise. How many it is, that like the statistics on that are very, very murky. A lot of women cross state lines, etc. So we don't know what the number will be. Obviously, an overwhelming majority of women who seek abortions are not married, and in most of these cases, the father isn't going to be in the picture. So we're increasing the number of children who either are being raised. Well, a lot of them will be put up for adoption, but certainly more children will be being raised by their single mother, a lot of times a single mother who's a teenager. And that is not the best environment to grow up in. Obviously, all the clearest thing in all of social science is that children are best off being raised by a pair of married parents. And so we'll increase the number who are raised in these suboptimal circumstances. Will that have negative effects? Theoretically, yes. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell tried to argue that abortion reduced the crime rate. I'm not convinced that that's true. I have trouble thinking about it in that way, because I have trouble pointing to somebody and saying, you shouldn't have been born. And so, am I dodging your question? Well, a little bit, yes. But I tried to wrestle with the real implications there. But if we really are try to be utilitarian and consequentialists in our discussion of children coming into the world, I think that's a dark road. I think we could say, okay, well, out of the three of us, Tim, Josh, and Will, like if we had to rank us, who would have been better off not being born? Who's the most valuable? And that's just, I don't like that way of reasoning.
Yeah, I'm definitely very sympathetic to your line of thinking. And to that point, I'm sure that this book is going to have its share of critics, if
hopefully.
It hasn't already, hopefully, right? And like, it's going to challenge some prevailing cultural and political narratives that are out there. How have critics so far responded to your arguments, and how do you engage critics? How have you done in the past? How do you plan to engage in as book reviews and all that stuff comes out now?
So I've not yet been blessed with that many critics. We'll see. But one of the forms—
That's a good way to think about it. Blessed with critics. I need to think about that one.
One of the forms of criticism is that I am trying to let parents off the hook by talking about the need for social support. I think a lot of people, and probably politically, this would be more folks on the right, because they value the parental authority and they value the nuclear family so much. They develop this mental model of the family where parents have full responsibility for kids at all times. And because you do see sometimes in public the kid who's acting up, the parent isn't even trying to whip them into shape. And then some people imagine if a kid is screaming or acting up, clearly the mom is doing something wrong in the moment or in general. And I hate that idea, but it's very widespread. And so just already, when I just did an MSNBC hit, some of the feedback wasn't a sort of liberal attacking me for wanting women to have more babies. It was somebody saying, I don't agree that it's society's job to raise people's kids. It's just the parents' job. So that's going to be one form of criticism. Obviously, again, the primary responsibility is with the parents, but parents are not enough to do it. From the left, I think a lot of my book takes on a lot of the current manifestations of feminism. And I say actually more stay-at-home parents would be good. And I acknowledge that a vast majority of those are going to be women. So I'm saying America needs more stay-at-home moms. I think that's going to upset a lot of people who totally reject that. There's a lot of people, especially in Washington, who think that our economic policy needs to reduce to approximately zero the number of stay-at-home moms, because that would be good for the economy. I say that a lot of modern feminism is workism, is turning women into company men, and I reject that. And so I expect I'll get some criticism for those arguments.
Well, I guess why stay-at-home mom instead of stay-at-home dad? I'm very pro stay-at-home parent. Personally, especially like in their early age before they go to school and whatnot. But, like if I'm and currently my wife does stay home just because of all the medical issues with our kids. But, I would have no issues reversing the roles if the roles were reversed. Although I think my wife does a much better job with my kids than I do, probably. Yep. So you can ask my kids if that's true or not. But I guess like what's the argument for a stay-at-home mom versus a stay-at-home dad?
Simply that's where the preference is. So I could argue from nature that when they're newborn, obviously dad can't nurse the baby, and there's a lot of science saying that the pregnancy really does form these bonds. And if a lot of dads are honest, they'll say, it wasn't until 8 months when my daughter was sitting up and really making eye contact that I really bonded with them. And so in those first few months, there's all sorts of biological reasons. And then just culturally, if you just poll parents, the ones who are more inclined towards full-time parenting are going to be women. So my argument isn't that we just need stay-at-home moms. It's we need more stay-at-home parents. And then one of the retorts is, but most of those people are going to be women. And I will say, yes, and they say, so this then creates economic inequality between men and women. And I say, but you're saying that their preferences are wrong. So who's being the good feminist here? Me saying more women want to stay at home, let's let them. Or you saying, no, women, you're doing it wrong, be more like the men. So again, I have no objection to stay-at-home dads. In fact, one of the things I say in the book is that if you had more stay-at-home dads, it would make it easier for other people to be stay-at-home dads. Where when I would be with the older kids when we had a newborn, and if I went to the playground and I was the only guy there, that provided some value, but at some point it's just like, A, this isn't as fun. B, it could be borderline inappropriate if I'm going to like mommy and me yoga classes as a dad. And so I said, if my old county, Montgomery County, was a pretty liberal county in Maryland, I said, what they should do is have If they want to be like gender equity people, have daddy and me like woodworking things with the kids during the day. Like really. And this gets at another point that like really dadding is different than momming. So now I'm not saying why there should be, but that really needs to be celebrated. We need a positive model of masculinity. And it's not going to be Andrew Tate. And it's not going to be, well, you can be just like mom and try to feminize dad. But instead, I always post on Twitter or Instagram when I go and I play my kids in basketball. Because I can still barely beat the one who's a little taller than I am, just because I'm more wily than he is. But then when I play my 9-year-old, I demolish him.
Yes,
and I get my other kids
nice.
to film me just absolutely stuffing Sean. If I could dunk on him, I would dunk on him all day, but I don't have those ups. My wife wouldn't get as much a kick out of destroying a 9-year-old in basketball as I do. So dadding is its own thing, and that's another thing we need to...
That's the only argument I needed.
I know. Well, it's funny. It's like if there were more stay-at-home dads, I'd imagine you would see an increased trend of like childhood injuries. Because like the level of tolerance that I have for my kids getting hurt is vastly different than my wife's. Like,
oh yeah, do you want to skateboard down the slide? Okay,
do it backwards. No, you know, my last question to you is just kind of on the topic of just having sort of a 2-parent household. Do any of the trend statistics that you looked at make any differences with like same-sex parents? You know?
Yeah, no, I looked at that a little, not deep enough to find that much of a difference. All of the data is kids thrive better when they have a pair of married parents. I haven't seen data that distinguishes between same-sex and opposite sex parents in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great question, Will, an interesting question. I remember, was it, I want to say it was Wilcox or something that brought out, maybe it wasn't, it was someone from the University of Austin that brought out a study that talked about how there's some difference, and it was seen as negative for children in a same-sex household. And then he got like drilled about it, and it caused a huge controversy. So I think there's definitely a need for more study on that and more kind of data along those lines. And we'll get that more, right? Since that 2015 decision, that'll come out more and more, I think, as the years go on. And so we'll be able to actually have more data to help us discern what's actually going on there. Now, whether it will be, whether I'm trying to think of how to say this without getting people getting angry at me, whether there's going to be a difference, right? That's yet to be seen, I think, but I don't know. I'm speaking out of a lot of ignorance in that regard. I did have one question though, this last question, and you're welcome to comment on anything I just said, but we have a lot of people, to Will's point, like we have a lot of people that watch this show that are in different walks of life. And they're, atheists and Christians and Muslims. And it's not like we are both Christians, but we try not to make this a distinctly Christian podcast necessarily. What is the message, the biggest message that you want them to hear from your heart, from the book, even just from you personally? And kind of tied with that, what's your biggest concern moving into the future in this election season, moving beyond what, I think I probably said it well enough there. What's your biggest concern, and what's the most important thing you want people to hear?
You hinted at some of the concern, which is a real despair and dourness about the future. I think that becomes self-fulfilling, because one of the things it does is it reduces optimism and hope. It also reduces trust. And that's one of the big enemies that I run into when I'm talking about this is, I don't trust my neighbors, so I can't let my kids run around the neighborhood. Or I don't trust our local schools anymore. So falling social trust is really my biggest concern, and that can spiral out of control because as people become less trusting, they might become less trustworthy, and that spirals out of control. So my hope and my message is that when I talk about the sadness, and sometimes we think that we're bad, and I'm a Catholic, I believe that I'm a sinner. I know that I sin. I go to confession, and one of the things we say in confession is, I resolve to sin no more. So far, I'm 0 for about 100 in sinning no more after confession. But that resolution is, I think that's what you feel when you look at your newborn baby. You think, look at this innocent child. I had that innocence. I frittered it away. I want to be a better person going forward. And so the hope and the motivation comes from your own child, but I think it more broadly comes from a society where you see the next generation. These people are going to inherit something. They're going to inherit what we inherited. So you think of yourself as being in a continuity rather than being this solo one-man sailboat sailing through treacherous waters. So family gives us that sense of being part of a continuity, and I think it will give us the hope.
That's so good. So how can people follow your work, and where can they get the book?
So Family Unfriendly is available anywhere books are sold. Go to your local bookstore and talk loudly about it in front of all the other customers, how great it is. It's on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, etc. I'm on Twitter at TP Carney for Timothy Patrick Carney. Check out WashingtonExaminer.com and AEI.org as well.
All right, great. Well, once again, guys, this has been Timothy Carney, and we really appreciate the conversation that we've had today. Tim, thank you for being on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. It was great.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thanks so much for watching and or listening. And until we see you next time, keep your conversations not left or right, but up. Thanks, guys. God bless.
See ya.